Hello and welcome to the Now TV Network. You're listening to Remnant Manna TV, and my name's David Mathews. I'm your host this afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you in our listening audience. We have got so much to talk about, so why don't you pull up a chair and come in and sit down with us for a few minutes. We have got to talk. The last time that I visited with you, we were looking at the plagues of the greater Exodus, and we do believe that we're living in that season. It's referred to as the end days. And I'm convinced that our scriptures are literally replete with patterns, blueprints, if you will, that you can begin to see all the way back in Genesis, beginning in chapter 1, that give us an indicator, if you're familiar with them, regarding what's going to happen in the days ahead. And I know that many of you are probably concerned because of all of the chaos that's in the world today, political upheaval, social and economic upheaval. Everywhere you look, there's so much strife and division going on because of the mandates that the government's putting on everybody and requiring you to kowtow to their whims. And so it looks as if that we have indeed entered into part of the season that I believe is reflected in the first three plagues that fell on Egypt and Israel. And that's why I wanted to begin to share with you some of the things that I believe are very pertinent to the season that we're living in. And in our last session, we looked at who our deliverer is. And that pattern was seen in Moses as the quote-unquote deliverer of Israel. We know that he was a foreshadow, if you will, of the Messiah. And so I had to ask you the question in our last session, who do you presume to be the coming deliverer of the body of believers in the days ahead? Now, that's predicated upon whether or not you believe that you're going to get out of here, if you will, in what's called the rapture, which I believe is one of the most damnable doctrines that's ever been taught to the body of Messiah, because those that have taught that and are currently teaching it are not preparing you for the chaos, the devastation that's coming our way like a runaway freight train. And if you go back and consider these patterns that we're talking about, you'll find that there is actually no indicator of a season in the future when the believing community is going to be taken out of the earth while the wicked's judged. In fact, the only pattern that I can see is exactly opposite of that, and that's in Genesis chapter 6 regarding the story of Noah, when you find Noah and his family, 7 individuals, 8 total, including Noah, were protected inside the ark. They were left here in the earth while chaos ensued, the earth was judged, and the wicked were taken out. And I want to remind you in Matthew 24, regarding these end days, verse 37, the Messiah says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. So it leads me to believe that we need to be familiar with these types and shadows, these patterns, if you will, if you want to understand what's going to happen. Now, as I alluded to earlier, we were talking about in our last session with you, and we were trying to lay a foundation because there's so much material that we wanted to cover. In fact, I have my latest book just came out, and it's called The Exodus Keys, Unlocking the Mysteries of the Great Tribulation. And if you want more information regarding what I'm sharing with you this afternoon, and I know that's a shameless plug, but I think that you should get that book because it reveals the things that are happening around us in society. It reveals the position that the world government should have taken to implement what we commonly refer to as a one world order, how that's going to affect you as an individual, how it's going to affect the believing community, how the world and the believing community are going to be polarized in opposition one to another. And so you need to find out what's going to happen so that you can be an effective tool in the hand of our Creator. And that's why I focused last session on Psalm 110 verse 1, and that verse says, sit thou, and this is the Father speaking in the first person, and he's speaking to the Messiah. But I also believe that there's another entity that's hidden there that he's speaking to and referencing as well, and we'll get into that because as I began to in the last session, I wanted to break that down in the Hebrew language so that you can see exactly who's being referenced. Now, why the Hebrew language? Well, let me just share this with you. It does not matter today what translation you are currently looking in, whether it's the King James, whether it's the New King James, the New Living Bible, the Message Bible, whether it's in Spanish, English, or any other translation aside from the Hebrew, you will find if you will look. And again, the onus is upon you as an individual to do what 2 Timothy 2:15 says, study to show yourselves approved unto Yahweh, workmen that need not to be ashamed. And how can you keep from being ashamed? You have to rightly divide the word of truth. And so if you will study these translations, if you will, you'll find that there are a lot of mistakes. Many of those mistakes are intentional in order to propagate an agenda that had been hidden. Yes, I'm going to just be very plain with you. The enemy has, throughout the ages, has infiltrated the camps of the believing community and has intentionally inserted things in the text in order to divert you from the truth of Abba's word. And so that's why we believe it's incumbent upon us as true students of the word to look at what the Hebrew language says if you want to really understand. Now, the Hebrew language is an alphanumeric language. In other words, every letter is not only a letter, it is also a numeral. And so if you see numbers in the text, then those numbers could also be interchangeable with letters and vice versa. Incidentally, the Hebrew language also has musical frequencies. It has a musical note assigned to it. It was originally intended to be sung, and you can see that again here in the Psalms, as we know very well that King David was the foremost psalmist in the earth at that particular time. Now, let me read Psalm 110, verse 1 for you, and then we're going to break it down, and we're going to see how these patterns are going to be revealed for us in the days ahead. And I believe as we break it apart, it will help you to find out who the believing community is, what the role of the believing community as the bride of Messiah is, and then prayerfully it will help you as an individual to wallow yourself out of spot so that you can find out exactly what part of the body you are. Now, Psalm 110 verse 1 says, "Sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies your footstool." Let's look at that word yeshav. In the Hebrew language, that word yeshav is the Hebrew equivalent of the word sit. And it means to point toward the union of the bride and her husband as the point at which whomever is at the right hand here of the Father becomes visible or manifest. And if you look at the way that it's referenced here, you'll find that the Father is indicating that Yeshua is going to be here at the right hand until his enemies are subjugated or made his footstool. Now, it's interesting because we understand throughout the New Testament that we are admonished to put on Messiah, Messiah being a garment. We know that he was the Word manifest in the earth. So you literally put on, if you will, the cloak of the Messiah or the cloak of his Word. And so it's interesting because we understand that as the bride, according to John 7:38, we're told that he that believeth on Messiah, Yeshua spoke this himself, as the scripture has said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. And that's why I believe it's, again, incumbent upon us to go back to the original language, to frame it in its proper context so that we can find out what these words actually mean. Now, again, let's look at that word for right. Sit thou on my right hand or at my right hand. In Hebrew, it's the word yamin. And it is, as you see here, very plainly associated with the right hand. The right hand throughout Scripture was the hand that was associated, or the position that was associated with the firstborn, with covenant, with authority, and with blessing. Now, if you look at the root of that word, it's spelled in Hebrew with yod mem yod nun. The root of it is the word aman. And that word aman means to trust, to place your trust in someone. Why? Because they have earned it. Trust does not come without one having earned it. And so you place your trust in someone who has already demonstrated their ability to produce a skilled work, to be in agreement with what you have stipulated, to be faithful to what you have spoken, that they are fully reliable, and therefore they are able to bring under their care, just like you brought them under your care, whatever it is that you have entrusted them with or charged them with. Now, it seems then to infer that our Messiah, sitting at this right hand, has, in the process of garmenting, if you'll allow me that term, another entity, placing himself in wrapping, enveloping someone else, that he's actually commissioned or endowed another that has also proven themselves reliable and trustworthy, skilled in faithful work, and has proven themselves as able to bring the creation under their care Now remember, as a co-regent, if they've brought creation under their care, it's under the care of our Messiah Yeshua, who was under the care of the Father. Now, having done that, they brought across the threshold of his house the foundational truths of his word. They've established his house in the earth by virtue of what was declared out of their mouth, and their actions have proven it. And so it's an indicator, if you remember of Romans chapter 8, verse 19, that we're told creation, and that creation is not just limited to what you can see with your natural eyes or hear with your natural ears. Creation entails everything that has been spoken into being, whether it's seen or unseen, eternal or carnal, and that creation waits for the manifestation of the sons of Yahweh. I would submit to you that when it says sons of Yahweh, that's also a dual term that can indicate the bride, because I believe that it is the bride who functions as the co-regent in the earth for her husband, Messiah Yeshua. And so if creation is underneath a curse and groaning, travailing until the manifestations of the Son of Yahweh, I would submit to you, then why would they be groaning? Why would the making visible of the sons of Yahweh, why would the making visible of the bride appease that groaning that creation has, if it was not for the fact that the sons of Yahweh, vis-a-vis the charge that's been placed in them, the bride, again, if you will, were not able to release creation from their curse or from their bondage. Now let's look a little bit deeper. He says, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. Now, the Hebrew word there for make is the word sheath, and it's divine. It's actually written here in the text in its adverbial form, but it could also, if it was to take on a noun form, it could also give us the Hebrew word for garment, same word. And it's interesting to me as I looked in the Hebrew text, because there's a hyphenated phrase in the Hebrew language, and it's the phrase ed, which means a witness or one who's able to give testimony. Ed as sheath. Now you see the root of that word sheath is in there, the word make, but there's another Hebrew letter appended to it, and it's the Hebrew letter aleph. Now the the word ed here is serving as a conjunction, meaning until. Sit here until. And it indicates that the word until, though it's not translated twice, it's actually written twice, and so it becomes a redundant word, and so you can remove that out. Again, the word ed indicates a witness or a testimony. And once you put that Hebrew letter aleph to the front of that word, sheath, ed, a sheath, it gives us third person, future tense, indicating I will. At some point in the future, I will. I am going to do this. This is Yahweh speaking to the Messiah who's at his right hand. He says, I will. I'm going to do something. Remember that word sheath also indicates a garment. And so if you were to extrapolate a definition here from the Hebrew text, you would literally, in addition to saying, sit here at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, you could literally say in the Hebrew language, you could read this, I want you to witness or to testify as I am, while you're sitting here now, bear in mind, he's sitting here until the enemies are subjugated. Sit here, witness and testify as I will garment them, clothe them with you, clothe them with me, which because Yeshua is the embodiment of the word of the Creator. Sit here until I garment them. Now, that would have been the end of that particular sentence, even though the verse continues. There's no punctuation in the Hebrew language, and so again you hear it as you read Psalm 110 verse 1, until I make thine enemies your footstool. Look at the word enemies. In the Hebrew it's the word oyev, and it's translated as enemies, but as you look at how it's written, it could imply your enemies. Sit here until I make your enemies. I'm going to garment someone. I want you to testify, witness as I garment them, and they're going to do something to your enemies. They're going to do something about your enemies. And we know that someone has to subjugate the enemies until, as long as Messiah's sitting at the right hand of the Father. Now, until I make your enemies your footstool. In Hebrew, that phrase is regel ha'adam, or excuse me, ha'adam la rageleka, and I probably did not do the Hebrew justice there, but it can actually be translated as your enemies are your footstool. Now this is interesting because it adds an entirely different viewpoint to what I believe is an amazingly powerful revelation. As you see in the text, Psalm 110, verse 1, and you see it in a number of different places in the New Testament quoted verbatim, it seems that our Messiah is occupying a specific place in the heavens, the right hand of the Creator, in order that, or while his ambassador, his co-regent, the sent ones on the earth, and I believe that that's specifically indicating the bride, who has been clothed in a messianic role as the living word, the one out of whom out of their belly will flow the living waters of his word. And I believe that he, the Messiah, is called to witness as Yahweh, the Father, the Creator, garments her. And so it could literally result in a different translation in the Hebrew text than what you see in the King James English. It could literally say this: your enemies sit here while your enemies have now become your, plural form, indicating the Messiah and the bride, while your enemies have become your footstool. This is powerful because you were created for this day that you're living in right now. Whether you measure up to the responsibility that Abba has given you, whether you can be found trusted or faithful, I don't understand how people could shirk their responsibilities when they know that there's absolutely no way that the enemy can overwhelm the bride. There's no way that we're going to leave out of here weak and beaten down, overwhelmed, downtrodden. When the body of Messiah is translated into the new millennium, into the kingdom of creation for eternity, we're going to enter into that millennial reign as a powerful entity that has already proven the world is going to be shaken, and it's simply because we raised the standard of his word in the earth. Now, let me share this with you. Many people, again, feel like the rapture is going to take place and that they'll be taken out of here before any of these things happen, before any of these plagues happen. And by the way, we haven't really even touched the plagues yet. We're still trying to lay a foundation. But let me share this with you. The Father will never do for you what you should be able to do for yourself first. Are you hearing me? And so I want to tell you, and I'm going to say this as plainly as I can. I want to be as kind to you as I can. But we need to grow up and take responsibility for walking in righteousness ourselves, or else how can we ever be proven as faithful in the days that are ahead? Now let me share this with you. It's an established fact, and nobody will argue with me. Even in the New Testament, we're told that judgment is going to begin first at his house. Now, judgment does one of two things. It is there to prove who needs to be punished or to decide who needs to be vindicated or exonerated. And I submit to you that if you're walking in righteousness and you're demonstrating the power of Yahweh's word, that you're going to be vindicated in the days ahead while all of the chaos that you see is vomited out on the earth. Now, how does what I've shared with you regarding who is going to be an instrument or the instrument in the hands of the Father as a purported deliverer in the days ahead, how does this affect how we look at these plagues that we see coming in the book of Revelation? You can see it in Joel. You can see it in Zechariah. You can see where Daniel talks about it. But if you want to go back and look at the original pattern, you have to go back to the Exodus plagues and look at those examples. And so I want to go back and I want to examine the first three plagues. Now that's interesting, because if that's indeed a pattern, it literally explodes the rapture doctrine, because again, judgment begins at his house first. And the first three plagues fell on both Egypt and Israel. Did you hear me? The first three plagues: blood, frogs, and lice. Now, during this season, while the three plagues are falling on both Israel and Egypt, I believe that it was simply a preparatory phase for the house of Israel, or the bride of Messiah, And it's interesting because we find something alluding to that in Revelation chapter 19, verse 7, which says this, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come." Listen to this. "And his wife has made herself ready." Did you hear that? His wife, his bride, has made herself ready. It doesn't say that she sat idly by, whining and moaning in grief and utter chaos while the Messiah made her ready. It says, no, she made herself ready. Now, as we look at that, you have to ask yourself, why was it that Israel, along with Egypt, had to experience these plagues? Let me read for you Exodus chapter 7, verse 17. "Thus saith Yahweh," and that's the Hebrew term for the Lord that you see in the bold caps in your text, "In this shalt thou know that I am Yahweh, I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the rod that is in your hand," or my hand, "upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood." Now, go back and look at Psalm 110, our main text. Look in verse 2. It says, "Yahweh, or the Lord, shall send the rod of his strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies." And so you have to once again ask yourself, who is this rod? It seems as if this rod was a symbol of royalty, the symbol of authority. But again, pay attention, it's also a symbol of authority and the ability to mete out judgment. And it's interesting because our Creator, Yahweh himself, the Lord, if you will, is speaking in the first person. "I will smite with the rod that's in my hand." Who is this rod? Now, you have to put this in its proper context in order to frame where we're going. If you look at the Hebrew word for rod, it's the word mateh, but it's written in Hebrew with the Hebrew letter bait appended to the front of it. But mateh, the bait, Hebrew letter bait, indicating in or with, but it can also reference the bride. And so, remember that Moses and Israel function in the role of Messiah and bride, just like I am trying to establish that I believe that Messiah and the bride in the days ahead are going to co-rule together, function together as the same. And it's also interesting, they functioned as one echad in a union, just like Genesis chapter 2 says that the man and woman should function, and the two became echad, the two became one, they functioned as one. And it's also interesting because that word rod that's translated there as a rod or scepter could indicate a branch. So the house or the bride has the scepter, has the rod, just like you see Moshe has the rod in our text there back in Exodus. And so I would submit to you that it's not a stretch of faith. And surely you can't accuse me of being blasphemous while I'm trying to share with you that I believe the bride is going to function in a future Mosaic, Messiah-type role in the earth when these plagues begin to be vomited out upon creation. And I know for a lot of you that's hard to believe, but go back and read 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And there's a measure of incredulity that's in that text as the Apostle Paul says, "What? Don't you know that you will judge angels? How much more then the house of Yahweh?" And then he spends a little time admonishing the people because they couldn't even judge or handle the little small matters. And so that's why I tell you now, we need to learn how to grow up and take responsibility for ourselves. Hard questions get hard answers. And these are the season, these are the days in front of us when some difficult times are coming. And we need to know why these things are going to begin to happen. For instance, the blood plague. That word blood is the Hebrew word for dam. And you remember, go back and read Exodus chapter 7, the Nile River was turned into blood. Well, that's interesting because go back and read the encounters there in the book of Exodus and then look at the pattern there in Revelation, and you see that blood once again is going to be poured out. Vials of blood, bowls are going to be poured out. Well, in that particular instance, they were poured out on the Nile River. And anybody that studies the plagues will tell you that each one of those 10 plagues was actually a judgment on a specific or particular god that the Egyptians worshipped. In this instance, the Nile River was represented by the god of the dead called Osiris, which was a green-skinned god of the underworld. And it's interesting because the Egyptians believed that Osiris was actually the god who allowed them to cross over into the eternal, and that the Nile River was actually the bloodstream of this deity, and each year during their flood stage that this quote-unquote God would be reborn. And so for all intents and purposes, Osiris could be referred to, and that's where some of the pagan doctrines get introduced into your scriptures. The god Osiris or the Nile River could be introduced as the firstborn of many brethren. And so again, that takes us back, in my opinion, all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, where you see the first instance of the shedding of blood. And we understand that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission for sin. And so no entity, no man has ever been sinless except for our Messiah. And so of our own efforts, by our own selves, we are incapable of being reborn. And so it's interesting. If you look at that word for blood, dam, and then look at it in reverse, you have the letters M, Mem, and Dalet, which gives us another Hebrew word for garment. And so it's interesting because I believe that there initially was a garment of light that shielded the Adam, and after the fall, that light changed into a blood garment. Now, this blood plague, in my opinion, that fell on Israel and Egypt was actually a call to true repentance and a return to faith in the shed blood of Messiah, not just looking at the shedding of the blood of bulls and goats, because the shedding of the blood of bulls and goats cannot produce a born-again experience. And so there's a contrast here between that Levitical order and the Melchizedek order as a living sacrifice. And by the way, we're admonished, go back and read Romans chapter 12, we're admonished to present ourselves living sacrifices. And so what you find here is that our Creator is trying to show Israel that there is going to be a substitute pattern allowed that could not completely atone for or completely exonerate you from sin, but it would only put it off or set it off until the coming of the last Adam, who would then offer himself as a blood sacrifice. Now, we've covered a lot of territory today already, and I know that many of you probably have questions. Again, if you want to get this book, The Exodus Keys, Unlocking the Mysteries to the Great Tribulation, I would suggest that you do so. It will help you. In the meanwhile, we're so honored that you've tuned in and listened for this short period of time. We'll be back every Tuesday. Thank you so much for tuning in. We love you.